Hi, good morning, everyone. This is Leah with Headwaters Science Institute, and welcome back to another Lunch with a Scientist. If you're new to this series, it's designed for you to get to know a scientist and what they do and see a little bit of their research. So today we are going to welcome Dr. Travis Hagey. So for those of you who may have seen last week's presentation on New Zealand tuatara with Christine Grayson, there'll be a little bit of a connection here. Travis Hagey has actually been to New Zealand and held a tuatara and taken a picture of its toe pads, which brings me to his research. So he is specifically focused on gecko toe pads, which you'll hear a little bit more about today. He's an assistant professor at Mississippi University for Women, investigating how geckos and other lizards with sticky toes climb surfaces. He's also interested in how lizards that live in different environments may have different toes as a result of adapting to their different unique habitats. So he combines evolutionary biology and engineering in his work, and he works with animals both in and out of the lab. And we are really excited to welcome Dr. Travis Hagey. Hi, Travis.
Hey, thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. We're so excited to hear more about geckos today.
Thanks.
All right, so I will let you take it away.
All right. And so as we said, I'm an assistant professor at Mississippi University for Women. And so today I'm going to be talking about geckos and some other lizards that have sticky toe pads. And so in a general sense, my research likes to ask, why are animals shaped the way they're shaped? If we go out in the wild and you can see different animals are different, plants are different, trees are shaped different. And so here I've got some pictures of lizards with long, skinny legs, kind of short, squat, tank-like lizards. Some lizards have googly eyes that help them see around their environment. Some animals are camouflaged. And so we can start to ask, why do we see all these differences? What are these animals doing differently that they need to be shaped different? And so we can start to do that by actually studying the animal the same way an engineer would study a machine. So here's like a picture of a kangaroo. We can break that kangaroo down the way an engineer would and ask, okay, how much force can its muscles produce? What's its acceleration? What are the angles that its joints work at? And actually help understand, based on the way it's shaped, what is it capable of doing? And then how does it use those capabilities in the wild to survive, catch food, avoid predators, do everything that it needs to do? And so what's also interesting is we can not only do that to better understand how animals adapt, but we can also copy them. And so here's a really cool video from Boston Dynamics, which are a set of engineers that build robots, and they actually mimic the robots on animals. And so this is a video of one of their robots that mimics how dogs run. And so you can see they've got this robot up to 14 miles an hour right now, and I think that ends up getting to 25 or 30 miles an hour by the end of the video. And so you can see understanding how animals move and operate can actually be really informative for us, not only to understand the animals better, but also mimic them. Because evolution has had a really long time to find really interesting solutions to really hard problems. See, they've got this robot up to 25, 27 miles an hour on a racetrack, on a treadmill. That's amazing. And then eventually the robot kind of develops a death wobble and they lift it off the racetrack. Right? And so helping, understanding how animals work is really valuable information. Because we also can understand how they use these capabilities in the wild, right? And so a really classically well-studied group of animals are lizards that live in the Caribbean. And so some of these lizards are adapted to live in the canopy. They're big. They have legs that are built really well for climbing in a complex environment. Some species are built to live on tree trunks. Some species are built to live on small skinny branches like twigs or bushes. And all these animals are shaped differently to help them survive in that specific environment. And so if I was giving this talk in person is now when I would ask you if you've ever had any pet lizards. I've got a couple different kinds of geckos in the lab. And so in chat or at the end, I'm going to be excited to hear what kinds of pet lizards you've had. And so remember to let me know at the end. I'm excited to hear. But generally, I study geckos. And so geckos are kind of well known for their sticky toe pads. They actually come in a huge variety of different types. There's almost 2,000 species around the world. They're one of the oldest groups of lizards. So they've been around a long time. They were around at the beginning of dinosaurs, 200 million years ago or so. And they come in tons of shapes and sizes. And so you've got some geckos that actually live on the ground and don't have sticky toes. And they run through sand, or they run through rocks or on the ground. You've got lots of geckos that climb, some that are bright and shiny, and they're active during the day. Some species are only active at night, and they're really cryptic, or they want to camouflage. Some species are really big. Some species are really small. So this is an adult gecko from South America, and it's only the size of a dime. And so there's a ton of variation. And then if we, so pretty much the way that I like to kind of approach these questions is asking, first off, how are they shaped? Specifically looking at their toe pads. And then based on how they're shaped, can we actually figure out how they work? What are they capable of doing? And then we can go out in the wild and ask, okay, what are the animals actually doing with their toe pads? How do they use them? And so for folks that aren't super familiar with gecko toe pads or how they work, try to stop for a second and think of all the different ways humans have invented different types of adhesives or different ways to hold one thing to another thing, right? We've got lots of different ways to do that. And so, and it all depends on what you're trying to attach and whether you want it to be removable or what it doesn't need to do, right? We've got things like Velcro, which aren't super strong, but they're really easy to take apart. We've got things like suction cups, which again, strong, but also removable, but the surface has to be really smooth and the surface can't have any holes in it, or otherwise suction cups don't work. We've got stuff like glue and tape. Works really well, not very removable. It's kind of permanent, right? We've got things like zippers and snaps and buttons where you're mechanically connecting the material together. And then we've got things like magnets, which we tend to think about as only working with metal, with electron clouds and stuff, right? Pushing and pulling positive, negative stuff, getting more into kind of chemistry. And so if you had to stop and guess, which one do you think geckos are most similar to? A lot of times people think Velcro or suction cups. But actually geckos are most similar to magnets, which seems really weird and seems really counterintuitive. But if we zoom in on the bottom of a gecko toe pad, a lot of them have horizontal bands on the bottom of their feet called lamellae. And these lamellae are actually flaps, overlaying flaps. And if we keep zooming in on these tiny little flaps, the flaps are covered in hair-like structures. These are reptiles, they're not mammals. And so they don't have hair the same way we have hair that's embedded into our skin. These are just extensions of the outer layer of their skin. And reptile skin is made out of the same protein that bird feathers are made out of, bird beaks. It's a protein called keratin. It's the same protein that our fingernails and our hair is made out of. So these are pretty stiff little hairs. They're also really, really tiny. And so you can see a cartoon of a human sperm cell, a cartoon of a red blood cell, and a cartoon of a tiny little blue E. coli next to those hairs. And so that kind of gives you a sense of scale of how small these things are. If we keep zooming in on the bottom left, to the top of the hairs, we can see that the hairs are branched and kind of curved backwards towards the palm of the foot. And then if we keep zooming in, we get to those tiny, tiny little tips of the tiny, tiny little branched hairs in the bottom right. And so the tiny little tips are only 200 nanometers wide. That's actually smaller than a wavelength of light that our eyes can see. So remember, blue light and red light, or blue to red light ranges from 300 nanometers to 600 nanometers, I think. So these tiny tip structures are smaller than the light waves that our eyes can see, which is really weird to think about. But when these small little hair tips get close enough to whatever the gecko's walking on, whether that's rocks or tree bark or leaves or glass or concrete or a metal fence, the electrons in the proteins that make up those hairs start to push and pull on the electrons on the thing they're walking on. And those electrons are attracted to one another. And so that's actually how geckos stick to stuff, is that their electrons push and pull on the surfaces that they walk on. and they're weakly attracted. But they have lots of tips and lots of hairs and big toes, so it actually produces really strong forces, even though each individual tip is only weakly attracted to the surface. So here's a video. I took some, this is when I was in graduate school, I took some hairs off a Gecko Toe Pad, connected it to a force sensor, and I'm lowering it onto a piece of glass and pulling it across that glass. And so these hairs are pulled and shaped backwards towards their palm. And so as they pull, the hairs actually act like mini springs. All of the tips of the hairs are attracted to the surface. And so as long as the gecko keeps those hairs taut, keeps those hairs in tension, the hairs pull up and away on the surface and the gecko can stick. And then when the gecko wants to detach, all they have to do is push their feet forwards, the hairs curve backwards again, and they can lift their foot off. So it's quick, it's easy to remove, it doesn't damage the surface, and it's really strong. We don't have any glues or suction cups or Velcro or anything that works that way. So this is a really new system, right? It's really different from anything we've invented. So there's a couple different ways you can measure how sticky a gecko is. You can grab a whole gecko, put a little harness on it, and pull them across a force plate. And they don't like this, but they tolerate it. Another way you can do it is actually measure the angle that their toes work at. And so this is another test I did during graduate school. I've got a live, slightly angry gecko, and he's holding up all of his body weight by one single back toe, just his middle back toe, on a piece of very clean glass. Even as that glass starts to turn upside down, they can still hold themselves up for a while. And this type of gecko doesn't have any claws. And so that's all just toe pad doing that. And so what's really cool is if you do this type of test for different types of geckos, the angle that they fall off at changes. Different types of geckos fall off at different angles. But it doesn't, you might think this depends on how much the gecko weighs. But so we've put little backpacks on them to make them weigh more, and they always still fall off at the same angle, because that angle has more to do with how their hairs are shaped and how their hairs are touching the surface. So what angle they fall off us actually tells us a lot about how the hairs are shaped, which is really cool. Like a lot like Spider-Man, right? And so now hopefully you've got a little bit of an idea of how things are shaped and a little bit of an idea of how things work. I want to kind of talk about how these things are connected. And so if we start looking at other different types of geckos, we see a ton of different types of toe pads. How do these things all work? Why are they different is a totally exciting question that we actually don't know the answer to. And so I've got some research projects looking at just how are things different for different types of lizards with toe pads. Because geckos aren't the only types of lizards that have these sticky toe pads. Anole lizards, which if you're living in the US, in the southern part of the US, Florida, Mississippi, Texas, North, South Carolina, Hawaii, you might see some of these types of lizards that aren't geckos, but they have really similar toe pads. And so they had a similar challenge. How can I climb trees better? And they solved it the same way geckos did, by developing these hairy adhesive toe pads. And so it's really fun to compare geckos and anoles because they've solved the same problem in almost the same way, but they're not that closely related. And so another interesting question is sometimes we'll look at two different types of geckos that aren't closely related. This is an Odura gecko from Australia, and that's what its toe pads look like. This is a Hemidactylus gecko from the Middle East, and this is what its toe pads look like. These toe pads look really similar, but these geckos live in totally different environments, totally different continents, and they're not closely related. So their ancestor, their shared ancestor, didn't have this type of pad. And so we can start to ask, why are their toe pads so similar? Are they solving a similar problem the same way? And so we can actually find species that are really similar and start looking at where's the similarity, what problem are they trying to solve that they both solve the same way? So that's called convergent evolution, when we see distantly related things with the same traits. So some examples of that, if you think of like bats and pterodactyls, both have these kind of wings built out of their arms with skin in between their fingers. They needed a way to fly, and so they solved the problem in a similar but slightly different way. Again, if you look at the body shape of a shark, an ichthyosaur, which is an extinct reptile, and a dolphin, you can see all three of them are kind of torpedo shaped, right? And it's because a torpedo-shaped body is really good at going through the water fast. So they found the same solution to the same problem they were having. Sometimes you'll see the same body shape in plants. A thicker body helps you not lose as much water, thicker leaves. If you've ever compared a hedgehog versus an echidna, which is a monotreme in Australia, they've got spines. You need a way to stop predators from biting you. This is a good solution. Flying squirrels, and there are also marsupial mammals that develop the same way to glide. There are also some reptiles, some lizards in Southeast Asia that have skin between their ribs. Again, it's another way to glide. So they're solving the same problem the same way. Lots of different species of fish in lakes in Africa. You can see different species have found the same solutions. So this comes up a lot in evolution, which is a really kind of fun comparison to make. But on the same side, we can also look at why things are different, right? If we have close related species that are using different parts of their environment, they might be really different. And so we can look at who's similar and who's different and why, and start to compare that to what they do out in the wild. Right? And so these geckos are fairly closely related, but their toe pads are really different. This species lives in Madagascar, an island off the coast of Africa. This species lives in Southern Africa and Namibia, and their toes are really different. And so we can start to say, okay, they're closely related, but they're really different. What are they doing that makes them different, right? Why do they need to be different? And so the next thing I want to talk about is, what are these animals starting to do in the wild? And so I've got a handful of different projects going on. One of them is just, again, measuring how different these different toe pads are at a really broad scale, trying to look at as many different types of geckos as we can. I've got another different project going on looking at how these hairs are shaped differently. And so different types of geckos have differently shaped hairs. These hairs are really small, and so they're hard to see. But I've got other projects going on trying to figure out how to see them in 3D. So if you've got questions about that, you can ask me questions about that too. But the project I wanted to talk about today is some research that some undergraduate students that I had last year that are now both, all three of them are starting graduate school, a project one of them did last year. And so this is them measuring data in the lab. This is them presenting their research earlier this summer, or earlier this year in Texas, in Austin, Texas. And so Bailey Howell was one of my students. She's a grad student now at Virginia Tech. And she had a project looking at one species of lizard in Puerto Rico. And so this is one species of a Anoles lizard, which has adhesive toe pads in Puerto Rico. It's Anoles chrysotellus. This species usually lives in the forest, towards the bottom of tree trunks. They're kind of a big, beefy lizard, and they'll live at the bottom of the tree trunk and they'll jump down to the ground and catch food. But what's interesting is some of these lizards in this species have started living in cities, started living in towns. And so there aren't trees in cities. And so you have to start finding a new habitat, new environment to live in. And they're starting to adapt to living in cities. They're getting bigger, they're getting longer legs, and they're also getting bigger toe pads, which is really interesting. So this is a new environment to them, and they're adapting to it and having to solve new problems by not living on tree trunks, but instead of living on fences or stop signs or street light poles or the sides of buildings. And so we're starting to see these changes. We know other previous studies have found they already have bigger toe pads, but we wanted to ask, how are their toe pads getting bigger? What does that mean? So are they just getting bigger and staying the same shape? Or are they getting bigger, in essence, by getting fatter and maybe staying the same length? Because if your toes get longer, that also affects how you run and everything else, right? Or maybe they're not getting fatter. Maybe they're just getting longer. We don't know how they're getting bigger. Either of these three solutions could be the answer, right? We just know they're getting bigger. And so that's what Bailey did, is she actually worked on outlining and measuring the exact shape of a whole bunch of different individual lizards so that we could actually start to think about, are these toes getting wider, longer, or just bigger altogether, right? So we use a method called geometric morphometrics, which you look at each picture and you put dots and measure lines. So we were able to measure the outside shape of a toe pad. We're also able to measure each specific lamellae on the bottom of their toe. And we were also able to measure things like toe length and toe pad width and toe pad length, and some really specific measurements on how the toe pad is shaped. And so we use geometric morphometrics. Bailey did this for 246 lizards. We had a handful of lizards from 7 different cities and 6 different forest sites. So we were able to kind of compare how different groups of lizards have been adapting in Puerto Rico to different cities. And what was really interesting is we started to see differences in different cities. Yeah, and so in essence, what we found was we already knew urban toe pads were getting bigger, but we actually saw that they were getting longer, right? So you can see I'm comparing an urban toe pad here versus a forest toe pad. The part of the toe that goes from the bottom of the toe pad to their palm is a lot shorter. And so they're actually shrinking the bottom part of their toe and lengthening the top part of their toe pad, which is really cool. So that has repercussions for how their feet work when they run and also when they climb. The other thing you can see is that the individual scales are sitting a little bit higher up in their toe pad. We know they have more scales on the bottom of their feet, but we weren't sure how they were fitting more scales, more lamellae into the bottom of their toes. And so we can see that they're shifting everything up, which also kind of helps explain how they're able to build these bigger toe pads. Which is really cool. And so that's kind of everything that I wanted to talk about for today. Let me know if you have more questions. I can talk about other projects. I'm excited to hear about what types of geckos or pet lizards you might have all had. I think that is it.
Thank you very much, Travis.
Yeah.
That was great. I kind of have a soft spot for geckos, to be honest with you. I'm from Hawaii, so I've seen a lot of geckos in my life.
Yeah, so I actually did field work in Hawaii 2 summers ago, 2018.
Great.
Yeah, so I was on Kauai and Oahu.
Yeah, it's a fascinating place for lots of species.
Yeah, and it's super fun because nothing is, as far as reptiles go, besides sea turtles, I don't think nothing's native. And so everything has been brought there by humans, either recently or within the last couple hundred years, 1,000 years maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And so how you take all these weird animals, smush them all together and figure out how they live together is really interesting.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you how you got into this research in the first place. For any of our students that might be watching, you work in a very specific niche with the gecko toe pads. How did you initially figure out what you might want to study and then turn that into a career?
Yeah, and so I'd always, like growing up, I was the kid that always had Legos and dinosaurs. And so those were my 2 kind of gateway drugs into getting a bachelor's degree, going to college to get a degree in biology. But I always kind of liked mechanics and taking stuff apart. So when I first got into graduate school, I actually really wanted to study genetics. But genetics is hard and it requires a lot of statistics. And I struggled with statistics. And so I want to say it was my 2nd year of grad school. My PhD advisor, who also studied geckos, came to me and told me about this gecko toe pad stuff. And he knew it would fit the way I kind of think about things with kind of engineering and biology. So it was his suggestion that kind of found the perfect topic for me. But then, yeah. So it was kind of luck and being in the right place at the right time a little bit.
Interesting. And I also wondered, now that you've moved into teaching, I see that you still do some research. So how do you balance that teaching with getting to do projects of your own?
That's not well. It's really hard to balance teaching and research. It's also going to depend on what kind of school you're at. Some schools, some universities expect their professors, their faculty to do a lot of research and they don't have to teach very much. Other jobs you have to teach and maybe you do less research. And so everybody's going to be a little different, but trying to find the right even amounts, I think it's tough for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems like you've still been able to get out into the field, so that's great.
Yeah, not recently, but within the last couple of years for sure.
Great. So going back to the talk, I was wondering that the research you presented in Puerto Rico, how long would it take for that type of adaptation to actually happen?
That's the interesting part, right? Because people have only been living in Puerto Rico 50 years, hundreds of years, right? Like, so quickly if you think about how fast we think evolution happens on a geological million-year scale, this is happening really fast.
Mm-hmm.
And other research shows that it can happen fast. There's research that's been done on the Galapagos Darwin's finches, with beak shape, that they're super classically well studied group. There's a couple of researchers that have gone out and looked at them every year for 30 years. And they find that their beak shape changes generation to generation really quickly to track what seeds are available year to year. But for a couple of years, they'll get bigger beaks, and then you'll have a decade of more rain, and it'll shift the other way, and then it'll shift the other way. And so evolution can jump really quickly and solve these problems, but 20 years from now, it might be solving a different problem. And so it's always hard to track or find evidence that this even happened 50 years from now.
So are you saying a change like this could happen and then no change could happen for some additional?
Or they could go back to small pads 50 years from now.
Interesting.
If the environment, if that's a better solution in whatever the environment is 50 years from now. Yeah.
So I'm also curious, I don't know if you have an answer for this, but in the beginning when you talked about how the toe pads actually work, there's kind of that electron attraction. Is that relationship different if the gecko is on a man-made surface like you would find in a city or a residential area?
Theoretically not, right? Not the chemistry of how their toe pads work, but generally human-made surfaces tend to be smoother, right? Like if you think of tree bark or rocks, they're pretty rough. And if you go and you walk around town, concrete is maybe the roughest thing you're going to see. Metals are smooth, wood is smooth, especially if you paint concrete, it's going to be smooth. Painted wooden fences, stuff's all smoother. And so their claws our working idea is that their claws don't help as much on smooth surfaces, so they have to use their toe pads more.
Interesting.
And so that's why they might be leaning towards bigger toe pads, is because it's not that the chemistry is different, it's just that the stuff's smoother.
Interesting. So I have a question here from Laura, one of our summer program students who's been awesome watching our talks. Are pet geckos or lizards or other reptiles considered domesticated like cats and dogs are?
That's a super interesting question, because then you get into, okay, what does domesticated mean, right? When we think of dogs and cats and barnyard animals, horses, sheep, cows, humans have been interacting with those animals for thousands of years, hundreds of years, and we've actually taken control of choosing which individuals get to breed. And so if we have some of those animals with traits we like, we let them breed, we let them have babies. And so they change each generation. And so they tend to like us better. They're not as mean, and they produce something that we want. They make milk or wool or whatever, right? So people have been breeding lizards, pet snakes along these same lines, but just not for as long. You can get pet corn snakes that come in all sorts of different colors. You can get pet leopard geckos that come in all sorts of different colors. Pet tokay geckos that come in different colors. So yes, but not as domesticated as cats, dogs, cows, sheep, just because we haven't been doing it as long.
Interesting.
Yeah, so kind of, but kind of not, right?
Yeah, and that kind of ties into a question I had about working with geckos. Obviously, if you're working with birds or something, they're a little bit easier to tag and study. They're larger. So working with something so small, and I noticed that you are kind of dealing with the way they are as well. You talked about the harness or the angry gecko. How do you navigate all those things specifically with geckos?
Yeah, and so again, it depends on which species you're working with. Some geckos are big-ish. So the biggest species of living gecko is it's a New Caledonian Rhachypdactylus leachianus, giant cave gecko, I think is its common name. It's the size of your arm. I mean, from your elbow to your palm. And people breed those as pets too. So you can, your everyday pet store won't have them, but you can buy them as a pet. And people have been breeding them maybe since the 80s to be pets. So some species are really big. Some species, and the combination is you want a big species that's nice versus a big species that's mean is gonna be a challenge to work with. Mm-hmm. And so there's a species from Southeast Asia called tokay geckos, and they're named that based on the sounds they make, the kind of a croak sound that sounds like the word tokay. They're big and they're top predators in their environment. Their body length is maybe the size of the palm of your hand, and then their tail is longer. And they'll eat anything they catch. They'll eat baby birds, they'll eat baby mice, they'll eat other lizards, they'll eat anything. And they don't care who you are, they're gonna try to bite you. And if you look at them, it looks like they have big cheeks. Those cheeks are actually their jaw muscles. And so anytime you see a lizard with big jowls, that's actually their jaw muscles. That's crushing force. Mm. And so they don't have big teeth. Think of like the grains on sandpaper. That's about the size of their teeth. And so they're not gonna cut your finger off or anything, but it's not gonna be fun. So if I work with tokay, usually I wear like leather gloves, just because I don't want to get all cut up, all tore up.
Interesting. So they all kind of have their different characteristics and personalities, sounds like.
Exactly. And that big leachianus gecko, the big cave gecko, they're a lot bigger than tokay, but they tend to be frutivores. So they eat fruit or nectar in the wild, and they don't have any other predators. And so they're actually really chill, and they're really nice, and you can hold them, and they make great pets. Even though they're super big, they're not really aggressive because they don't have to be. Hmm. And so each species kind of has its own personality based on where it is in the food chain.
Right. So another question about their characteristics: are there geckos without sticky toe pads?
Yeah. So yes, lots of species actually have not. Lots of species don't have toe pads, and so there's 7 families of geckos. There's 2 whole families that don't have any toe pads at all. They just have regular lizard feet. One family is found only in Australia, and another family is found in Africa and kind of the Middle East, parts of Asia. Like if you have a pet leopard gecko, a leopard gecko doesn't have toe pads. They just have regular claws with toes with claws for climbing rocks. And then one of the families of geckos actually is completely limbless. They don't have any arms. They look a lot like snakes, and they've evolved along the same path that snakes have to burrow. And so they're only found in Australia, but there's actually a whole group of geckos that don't have any arms or legs.
Fascinating. Mm-hmm. So looking forward, where do you think you will go next with your research?
There's so much cool stuff to do. So as we talked about, texture is a really interesting thing that we need to start thinking about. Because in the up until now, the easiest way to categorize geckos as far as their ecology is, do they live on the ground, do they live on rocks, or do they live in trees? That's kind of how we've done that so far. But that's not that informative. You can have smooth rocks, you can have rough rocks, you can have dusty bark, you can have really rough, sharp bark. If they're living on a tree, are they living on the leaves or the bark? Because that's totally different. And so how do you measure how rough or smooth something is? That's hard to do too, especially if it's a giant rock in the middle of the forest somewhere. What do? Chip a piece of that off and bring it home? That's hard to do. And I don't know if we should be doing that anyways. And so how do you measure texture, and how do you measure those little hairs on the bottom of gecko toe pads? And how do those work together? There's a ton of cool stuff we could do there. So that's where I'm working on going next.
Great. And will that take you into the field, hopefully?
Hopefully. I've got a couple grants in review right now.
Great.
For 2021, hopefully. Hopefully by 2021, things will be back to normal, and it'll, Americans will be allowed on airplanes again and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But not anytime soon.
Well, we hope that you get back out into the field soon. It sounds like a fascinating project.
Yeah, thanks.
So we're going to wrap up soon, but I wanted to kind of come full circle here. You started your talk looking at animal behavior in general and how the way that they're built kind of determines the way that they behave or the way that they are, talking about how they develop. So I wanted to ask, how does studying gecko toe pads specifically kind of relate to the broader picture of looking at the animal kingdom?
Oh, yeah. How does it relate to the animal kingdom? So I think I think I like the gecko question because, as I talked about, you see lots of examples of convergence, distantly related things that end up being really similar, which is kind of the first thing you'll notice. And then you can go out in the wild and look at, okay, why did they evolve these similar traits, even though they were there in the past? Neither species had it, and that's a general phenomenon we see across plants and animals and everything, right? That's a real general pattern that we see. And on the flip side, you can find examples of closely related things colonizing new habitats and developing different traits, like the Puerto Rican anoles. And again, that's a super general pattern that everything goes through as new environments open up and climates change or urbanization spreads or all that kind of stuff. And so you can kind of get at just how the evolutionary process works in general by studying divergence and convergence.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Gives us kind of a big picture of how things are related and how things are changing. Great.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, Travis Hagey, thank you so much for sharing your research. We're totally fascinated, and now we want to know more about geckos. If you're watching and you do want to know more, you can always leave a question or comment on our Facebook feed or our YouTube feed, and we'll get it to Travis. And thank you so much for watching. Dr. Travis Hagey, thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right. Have a good day.
Thanks.
Bye.